The massive doors of the Galactic War Crimes Tribunal swung open with a deep rumble that echoed through the crystalline chamber like thunder rolling across distant mountains. Kate Morrison stepped through the doorway, her black military boots clicking against the polished stone floor with each measured step. The sound seemed tiny and insignificant in the vast space that stretched out before her, like a cathedral built for giants. She wore her dress uniform with perfect precision, every medal and ribbon placed exactly where regulations demanded. The dark blue fabric was crisp and clean, pressed to sharp lines that could cut glass. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, not a single strand out of place. Her green eyes looked straight ahead as she walked, never wavering, never showing the fear that twisted in her stomach like a living thing. The courtroom was unlike anything found on Earth. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet above, made of some kind of crystal that caught and reflected light in impossible ways. The walls curved inward like the inside of a massive egg, covered in symbols and writing from a dozen different alien languages. Floating platforms held observers from across the galaxy, their strange forms casting odd shadows in the shifting light. At the far end of the chamber sat the judge's bench, a crescent-shaped structure that rose from the floor like a natural formation. Behind it sat 5 beings that represented the most powerful species in the known galaxy. Each was different from the others, shaped by evolution on distant worlds under alien suns. The center seat held Supreme Arbiter Zethkalar of the Valorian Empire. He was massive, standing nearly 12 feet tall even while seated. His skin was the color of deep purple bruises, covered in scales that reflected light like armor. 6 eyes arranged in 2 rows studied Kate as she approached, each one the size of a human fist and glowing with an inner fire. 2 pairs of arms crossed over his broad chest, muscles rippling beneath the scaled hide. When he breathed, the sound was like wind through cave systems. To his left sat Judge Vorthai of the Crystal Collective, a being made entirely of living mineral. Her body was translucent blue-green stone that pulsed with internal light. She had no mouth that Kate could see, but when she spoke, the words seemed to come from the crystal formations that grew from her head like a crown. Her movements were slow and deliberate, like continental drift made visible. On the right side of the bench perched Judge Silara of the Asari Republic. She looked almost human except for the blue skin and the tentacle-like growths that hung from her head, instead of hair. Her eyes were solid black, reflecting nothing, giving away no emotion. She wore robes that seemed to be made of liquid starlight, shifting and flowing even while she sat perfectly still. The 4th judge was Admiral Korthvan of the Centauri Federation. His forearms moved constantly as he reviewed documents on holographic displays that only he could see. His skin was pale gray, stretched tight over a skull that was too large for any human. 2 hearts beat in his chest at different rhythms, creating a complex percussion that Kate could hear from 50 feet away. The final judge was the strangest of all. General Thexmore of the Hive Collective looked like a giant insect wearing judicial robes. His compound eyes took up most of his triangular head, thousands of tiny lenses that could see in spectrums no human could imagine. When he moved, it was with the quick, jerky motions of a praying mantis. His 4 arms ended in hands that had too many joints, allowing them to bend in ways that hurt to watch. Kate stopped at the defendant's table, a simple metal surface that looked pathetic compared to the alien grandeur surrounding it. Her defense attorney was already there, Commander Jake Sullivan from Earth's Diplomatic Corps. He was a thin man with gray hair and tired eyes, wearing a uniform that had seen better days. He looked up at her with worry written across his face like text on a page. The gallery behind them buzzed with conversation in dozens of languages. Representatives from every major species had come to watch this trial. Some floated in tanks of liquid, others perched on special platforms designed for their unique biology. A few looked almost human, while others were so alien that Kate had to force herself not to stare. Near the front sat a group of humans, the only friendly faces in the crowd. They wore the uniforms of Earth's Space Navy, their expressions grim but supportive. Kate recognized a few of them from her service days, officers who had served under her command or alongside her in various campaigns. Their presence gave her strength, a reminder that she was not alone in this place. Supreme Arbiter Zethkalar raised one of his massive hands, and silence fell over the courtroom like a blanket. When he spoke, his voice was deep and rumbling, like rocks grinding together in an earthquake. The translation devices built into the courtroom walls converted his words into 100 different languages simultaneously. "This tribunal is now in session," he announced, his 6 eyes fixed on Kate with obvious disgust. "We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Lieutenant Commander Kate Morrison of the Terran Space Navy, charged with crimes against sentient life in the Battle of Kepler 442. He paused, letting the weight of the charges settle over the room like dust. Kate could feel the eyes of hundreds of beings focused on her, most of them already convinced of her guilt. The trial had not even begun, but she could sense their hunger for justice, their desire to see humanity brought low. The accused stands charged with genocide, war crimes, and violations of the Galactic Accords on the treatment of prisoners, Zethkalar continued. His voice carried contempt like poison, each word dripping with disdain. 17,000 beings died as a direct result of her actions. 17,000 souls who will never see their homeworlds again, never embrace their loved ones, never contribute to the galaxy's future. Kate stood at attention, her face showing no emotion. Inside, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. She had known this day would come eventually. The war had ended 3 years ago, but the galaxy had not forgotten the Battle of Kepler 442. How could they forget when so many had died? "Look at her," Zethkalar said, gesturing toward Kate with one of his massive hands. A weak creature from a primitive world, barely 5 feet tall and weighing less than most juveniles of civilized species. Yet we are to believe that this thing was capable of commanding a fleet action that resulted in such massive loss of life. The alien judges murmured among themselves, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of strange sounds. Kate caught fragments of their conversation through the translation systems. They spoke of humans as if discussing a particularly troublesome species of vermin, something to be controlled rather than respected. "How does such a weak being justify such brutality?" Zethkalar asked, his 6 eyes narrowing as he studied Kate. What could possibly drive a creature so obviously unfit for command to commit such atrocities against superior beings? Kate remained silent as her attorney had instructed her. This was not the time to speak, not yet. She had to wait for the right moment, had to let them reveal their prejudices and assumptions before she could strike back. The truth was her weapon, but timing was everything. The Supreme Arbiter smiled, showing teeth like broken glass. He had already decided her fate, that much was clear. This trial was just a formality, a chance to humiliate humanity before the galaxy. But Kate had faced impossible odds before, and she had always found a way to win. This time would be no different. Prosecutor General Vex Thani rose from her position near the front of the courtroom with a movement that was both graceful and terrifying. She belonged to the Naga species, serpentine beings from the distant spiral arm, who had joined the galactic community only 50 years earlier. Her body was covered in scales that shifted color depending on her mood. Currently a deep crimson that spoke of anger and righteous fury. Her lower body was that of a massive snake, easily 20 feet long when fully extended. The tail coiled and uncoiled behind her as she moved, a constant reminder of the predator nature that lurked beneath her civilized exterior. Her upper body was more humanoid, with 2 arms that ended in hands equipped with retractable claws. Her head was elongated with a jaw that could unhinge to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. But it was her eyes that were most unsettling. They were solid gold without pupils or irises, and they seemed to glow with an internal light. When she looked at Kate, those eyes held nothing but cold calculation and hunger for justice. She wore the formal robes of her office, dark fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Honored judges," Vex Thani began, her voice carrying the subtle hiss that marked all Naga speech. "Today we witness the trial of a creature whose actions have scarred the galaxy and brought shame upon her entire species. Lieutenant Commander Kate Morrison stands accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Acts so brutal and senseless that they challenge our understanding of civilized behavior." She gestured with one clawed hand, and the air above the courtroom filled with holographic displays. The images that appeared made even the hardened military observers in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. These were the aftermath photos from the Battle of Kepler 442, scenes of destruction so complete that they looked like something from a nightmare. Broken ships drifted through space like the bones of dead giants. Hull metal had been twisted into impossible shapes by forces beyond imagination. Debris fields stretched for thousands of miles, filled with the scattered remains of what had once been a proud fleet. Emergency beacons still flashed among the wreckage, calling out to rescuers who would never come. "Behold the handiwork of the accused," Vexithani continued, her scales shifting to a deeper shade of red. 17 ships of the hegemony fleet completely destroyed. Not damaged, not disabled, but obliterated so thoroughly that forensic teams could barely identify the species of those who died aboard them. The images changed, showing casualty reports that scrolled endlessly through the air. Names, ages, homeworlds, next of kin, each entry representing a life cut short by violence. The numbers were staggering, a catalog of death that seemed to go on forever. Kate watched the display without flinching, though inside she felt the familiar weight of command decisions settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Every name on that list was burned into her memory. She had not killed those beings lightly or without thought. Each death had been a calculated choice, made under impossible circumstances with limited options and even less time. "The defendant claims these actions were necessary," Vexithani said, her voice dripping with scorn. "She speaks of military necessity, of protecting civilian populations, of following orders. But let us examine the facts without the filter of human propaganda and self-serving justification." New images appeared, showing the hegemony ships as they had been before the battle. They were beautiful vessels, sleek and elegant, designed by beings who understood both function and form. Their hulls gleamed like polished silver, covered in geometric patterns that served both practical and artistic purposes. Each ship was a work of art as much as a weapon of war. These were not warships in the traditional sense, Vexithani explained, slithering closer to the judge's bench. The hegemony fleet was primarily composed of exploration vessels, science ships, and diplomatic craft. Yes, they carried defensive weapons, as any ship must in these dangerous times, but they were not built for conquest or aggression. Kate's attorney, Jake Sullivan, made a note on his datapad. That was not entirely accurate, and they both knew it. The hegemony fleet had been heavily armed despite its supposed peaceful mission. But Vexithani was skilled at presenting facts in the light most favorable to her case. According to the defendant's own after-action reports, the prosecutor continued, she engaged the hegemony fleet without warning, without attempting communication, and without offering them the chance to surrender. Her ships opened fire at maximum range using weapons specifically designed to cause maximum damage to enemy vessels. The holographic display shifted again, showing tactical readouts from the battle. Kate recognized the data streams. They had been pulled from her own ship's computer systems. The prosecution had access to everything, every order she had given, every decision she had made during those crucial hours. "Note the weapon selection," Vexithani pointed out, highlighting specific entries in the tactical log. Plasma torpedoes with enhanced penetration warheads, fusion cannons set to maximum yield, particle beam arrays configured for deep hull penetration. These are not the weapons of a commander seeking to disable enemy vessels. These are the tools of genocide. Judge Zethkalar nodded approvingly, his 6 eyes never leaving Kate's face. "Continue, prosecutor. We are eager to hear the full extent of this creature's crimes." Vexithani's scales shifted to an even deeper red, almost black now with satisfaction. "The battle lasted exactly 47 minutes, she said. In that time, the defendant's forces completely destroyed 17 ships, damaged 5 others beyond repair, and scattered the remaining fleet across 3 star systems. The speed and efficiency of the attack suggest pre-planning and deliberate intent to maximize casualties." More images filled the air, showing the progression of the battle from multiple angles. Kate watched her own tactical decisions play out in cold clinical detail. She remembered every moment, every choice, every desperate gamble that had somehow worked. But perhaps most damning of all, Vexithani continued, is what happened after the main engagement. Several hegemony vessels attempted to surrender, broadcasting standard capitulation codes on all frequencies. The defendant's response was to target their communication arrays first, then their life support systems, then their escape pods. The prosecutor paused, letting that sink in. Targeting escape pods was considered one of the most heinous war crimes possible, a violation so severe that it carried mandatory death sentences in most galactic legal systems. 17,000 beings died in the vacuum of space, Vexithani said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried clearly through the vast chamber. 17,000 mothers and fathers, children and elders, scientists and artists and philosophers, all snuffed out by the actions of one small, weak human who somehow found herself in command of weapons she was never meant to wield. Judge Celara leaned forward, her black eyes reflecting the holographic displays. "Prosecutor, what evidence do you have regarding the defendant's qualifications for command? Surely someone entrusted with such responsibility would have extensive training and experience." Vexathani's expression shifted to what might have been a smile if she had been human. "That is perhaps the most shocking aspect of this case, honored judge. According to military records, the defendant had never commanded anything larger than a single destroyer before the Battle of Kepler 442. Her promotion to fleet command was a battlefield expedient, made necessary by the death of her superior officers. The implications hung in the air like toxic gas. An inexperienced commander, thrust into a situation beyond her abilities, making decisions that resulted in massive loss of life. It was a prosecutor's dream and a defense attorney's nightmare. She was 28 years old at the time of the battle, Vexathani continued, really warming to her theme now. 28 years old, with less than 6 years of military service, commanding a fleet action against experienced hegemony officers who had decades of training and combat experience. The very idea that such a being could be entrusted with such responsibility speaks to the fundamental flaws in human military organization. Jake Sullivan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was going worse than he had expected. The prosecution was painting Kate as an incompetent amateur who had stumbled into command and then panicked under pressure. It was a narrative that played perfectly to alien prejudices about human weakness and inexperience. "In conclusion," Vexathani said, her scales now shifting back toward their normal green coloration, "we have before us a clear case of criminal negligence resulting in mass murder. The defendant was unqualified for command, unprepared for the situation she faced, and ultimately responsible for one of the greatest losses of life in recent galactic history. Justice demands that she pay the ultimate price for her crimes." The prosecutor slithered back to her position, coiling her massive tail beneath her with obvious satisfaction. She had presented her case with skill and precision, building a narrative that was both compelling and damning. Now it was up to the defense to somehow find a way to counter the overwhelming evidence of Kate's guilt. Judge Zethkalar looked down at Kate with undisguised contempt. "Defendant, you have heard the charges against you. How do you plead to?" Commander Jake Sullivan rose from his chair with the careful movements of a man who knew he was walking into a firestorm. His gray hair was neatly combed, but Kate could see the stress lines around his eyes that had not been there when they first met. He carried himself with the dignity of a career diplomat, but she sensed the uncertainty beneath his professional exterior. Sullivan had been Earth's top military defense attorney for over 20 years. He had defended soldiers accused of everything from insubordination to murder, and he had won most of those cases through careful preparation and skilled argument. But this case was different. This was not a human court with human judges who understood human motivations and circumstances. This was alien justice with alien values and alien prejudices. He activated his data pad and the holographic displays above the courtroom shifted to show new images. Where Prosecutor Vexathani had shown destruction and death, Sullivan began with maps and tactical assessments. The images were clinical and precise, showing star charts and fleet positions with mathematical accuracy. "Honored judges," Sullivan began, his voice carrying the careful modulation of a trained speaker, "the prosecution has painted a picture of senseless violence and criminal negligence, but they have failed to provide the most important element of any military analysis: context. Without understanding the circumstances that led to the Battle of Kepler 442, it is impossible to judge the actions of any commander involved." He gestured toward the displays, and the star charts zoomed in to show the Kepler system in detail. 3 planets orbited the yellow star, with Kepler 442b highlighted in blue. The planet looked peaceful from space, a blue-green world with swirling white clouds and vast oceans. Kepler 442b was home to 2.3 million human colonists, Sullivan explained. These were not military personnel but civilians, farmers, teachers, doctors, engineers, children, and elderly citizens who had spent their entire lives building a new world far from Earth. They had no military defenses, No warships, no way to protect themselves when the hegemony fleet arrived in their system. New images appeared, showing the colony from ground level. Small cities dotted the landscape, connected by roads and transport tubes. Agricultural zones stretched to the horizon, filled with crops that fed not just the local population but several other human worlds. It was a picture of peaceful prosperity, a testament to human determination to build something beautiful, even in the depths of space. Judge Vorthai, the crystalline being from the collective, spoke for the first time. Her voice had a musical quality, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Defense counsel, what relevance does this have to the charges against the defendant? The colonists were not harmed in the battle. Sullivan nodded respectfully. With respect, honored judge, the colonists were very much in danger. The hegemony fleet had been conducting what they called pacification operations throughout human space for 6 months prior to the Battle of Kepler 442. In every previous case, those operations had resulted in the complete destruction of human settlements. The displays changed again, showing the aftermath of previous hegemony attacks. Burned cities, empty colonies, mass graves where civilian populations had been systematically eliminated. The images were brutal and uncompromising, a stark reminder of what war looked like when it came to the innocent. 17 human colonies had been attacked in the 6 months before Kepler 442. Sullivan continued. Not one civilian survived. The hegemony's strategy was simple and effective. Eliminate human presence in disputed territories by killing everyone who lived there. Men, women, children, the elderly, the sick, none were spared. Prosecutor Vexthani rose to object, her scales shifting to an angry orange. Objection, honored judges. The defense is attempting to introduce evidence not directly related to this case. The actions of other hegemony forces do not justify the defendant's crimes. Judge Zethkalar considered this, his 6 eyes moving between Sullivan and Vexthani. The court will allow the evidence, but counsel is advised to connect it directly to the defendant's actions. We are not here to try the entire war, only this specific incident. Sullivan bowed slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. The relevance will become clear shortly. He touched his data pad again, and the displays showed a timeline of events leading up to the battle. On the morning of the attack, Lieutenant Commander Morrison received intelligence that the hegemony fleet was approaching Kepler 442 with obvious hostile intent, Sullivan explained. Long-range sensors detected 17 warships moving in standard attack formation. Their course and speed indicated they would reach the planet in less than 6 hours. The tactical display showed the fleet movements with clinical precision. Red dots representing hegemony ships moved steadily toward the blue dot of Kepler 442b, while green dots showed the human defensive forces moving to intercept. The defendant found herself in command of 5 destroyers, 2 cruisers and 1 heavy battleship, Sullivan continued. 8 ships total against 17 enemy vessels. The mathematics of space combat are unforgiving. When outnumbered more than 2 to 1, the conventional wisdom is to retreat and call for reinforcements. Admiral Korthvan, the 4-armed Centauri judge, leaned forward with interest. His species were known throughout the galaxy as master tacticians, and he understood military necessity better than most. Defense counsel, why did the defendant not withdraw to await support? Sullivan had been hoping for that question. Because there was no support coming, honored judge. The nearest human fleet was 8 days away at maximum speed. By the time help could arrive, 2.3 million civilians would have been dead for over a week. The weight of that statement settled over the courtroom like a physical presence. Even the alien observers in the gallery seemed to grasp the implications. Kate had been faced with an impossible choice: fight against overwhelming odds or abandon millions of innocent people to certain death. Furthermore, Sullivan continued, evacuation was not an option. The planet had only a dozen civilian transport ships, each capable of carrying perhaps 1,000 people. Even if every ship had been loaded to dangerous overcapacity, they could have saved less than 15,000 colonists. The remaining 2.2 million would have been left defenseless. The displays showed the pitifully small human transport fleet compared to the massive planetary population. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. There was simply no way to save everyone through evacuation. Judge Silara spoke next, her black eyes reflecting the holographic data. What was the defendant's experience level at the time of this engagement? The prosecution has suggested she was unqualified for such responsibility. Sullivan had prepared for this question as well, though he knew it was dangerous territory. Lieutenant Commander Morrison had 6 years of military service at the time of the battle. She had served aboard 7 different ships in various capacities, from junior officer to executive officer. Her service record showed consistent excellence in all assignments. He paused, knowing that what he was about to say would sound inadequate. However, it is true that she had never commanded a fleet action before. Her previous independent command had been limited to single-ship operations. The admission hung in the air like an accusation. Kate could see the alien judges exchanging glances, their various forms of communication creating a subtle buzz of conversation. They were thinking exactly what Sullivan had feared, that she had been dangerously unqualified for the responsibility thrust upon her. But, Sullivan continued quickly, the defendant did not seek this command. She assumed it only after the death of Admiral Crawford in a hegemony ambush 3 days earlier. Military protocol dictated that the senior surviving officer take command, and that officer was Lieutenant Commander Morrison. The displays showed the organizational chart of the human fleet, with Kate's name highlighted in yellow at the bottom of the command structure. Red lines crossed out the names above her: Admiral Crawford, Captain Stevens, Commander Blake, all killed in previous engagements with hegemony forces. She was the last officer standing, Sullivan explained, not by choice, not by ambition, but by the simple mathematics of survival. Someone had to make the decision to fight or flee, and military law placed that burden on her shoulders. General Thexmore, the insectoid judge from the Hive Collective, clicked his mandibles together in a pattern that indicated deep thought. Defense counsel, you have established the defendant's circumstances but not her justification. Many commanders have faced similar odds and chosen to preserve their forces rather than engage in hopeless battle. Sullivan nodded respectfully. That is true, honored judge, and under normal circumstances, withdrawal would have been the correct tactical decision, but these were not normal circumstances. The defendant had access to intelligence that changed everything. He touched his datapad again, and the displays showed intercepted communications from the hegemony fleet. The alien text scrolled past too quickly for most observers to read, but Sullivan provided translation. 3 hours before the battle, human intelligence intercepted hegemony communications discussing their plans for Kepler 442, he explained. The messages were clear and unambiguous. Every human on the planet was to be eliminated as part of their pacification strategy. No prisoners, no evacuations, no mercy. The hours passed like a slow torture as the trial continued through the afternoon. Jake Sullivan presented evidence methodically and carefully, building his case piece by piece like a master craftsman, assembling a delicate machine. He showed tactical analyses from military experts, character witnesses who testified to Kate's integrity, and historical precedents for difficult command decisions made under extreme pressure. But Kate could see that his efforts were having little effect on the judges. Their minds had been made up before the trial even began. This was not about justice or truth. This was about showing the galaxy that humanity could be brought to heel, that even their best and brightest could be humbled before alien authority. Judge Zethkalar made no effort to hide his contempt. Every time Sullivan spoke, the massive Valorian would lean back in his chair and examine his claws with obvious boredom. When witnesses testified on Kate's behalf, he would interrupt with hostile questions designed to undermine their credibility. His 6 eyes never left Kate's face, studying her like a predator watching wounded prey. Defense counsel, Zethkalar rumbled during a brief recess. Your client sits there like a stone statue. Does she have nothing to say about these grave charges? Or perhaps she recognizes the futility of defending the indefensible? Sullivan shot Kate a warning glance before responding. My client will speak when the time is appropriate, Your Honor. For now, she chooses to let the evidence speak for itself. The judge's laugh was like grinding metal. Evidence you call character references and tactical analyses evidence? You have shown us nothing that changes the fundamental facts of this case. 17,000 beings died because of her actions. No amount of testimony can bring them back to life. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the prosecution and the judges were working together to orchestrate Kate's downfall. Fexthani would present damaging evidence and the judges would ask follow-up questions that made it seem even worse. When Sullivan tried to object or present counter-evidence, his efforts were dismissed or minimized. The gallery began to thin as observers lost interest in what appeared to be a foregone conclusion. Even the human military officers who had come to support Kate looked discouraged. Their presence had been meant to show solidarity, but faced with the overwhelming hostility of the alien court, they seemed powerless to help. Kate watched it all with growing anger, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. She had faced many battles in her career, but this felt different. On the battlefield, enemies fought with weapons and tactics that could be countered with skill and courage. Here, the weapons were prejudice and procedure, and there seemed to be no defense against them. As the day drew toward evening, Judge Zethkalar called for a final recess before closing arguments. The courtroom began to empty as beings of various species headed for food and rest. Kate remained at the defendant's table, reviewing notes and trying to prepare for what might be her last chance to defend herself. "Kate," Sullivan said quietly, leaning close so their conversation would not be overheard. "This is not going well. The judges have already decided your fate. When we reconvene, I think you should consider making a statement. Appeal to their sense of military honor. Acknowledge the deaths while explaining your reasoning." Kate looked at him with tired eyes. "You want me to beg? I want you to live," he replied. "Pride is a luxury we can't afford right now. These beings see you as nothing more than a primitive human who got lucky and stumbled into command. Maybe if you show them some humility, some recognition of the weight of your decisions on—" "No," Kate said firmly. "I won't apologize for saving 2 million lives. I won't beg aliens for forgiveness because I chose to fight instead of running away." Sullivan sighed, recognizing the stubborn determination that had made Kate both a hero and a target. "Then we'll stick to the evidence and hope for the best. But Kate, you need to understand. This trial was never about determining your guilt or innocence. This is about putting humanity in its place." When court reconvened an hour later, the atmosphere had shifted subtly. The judges seemed more relaxed, more confident, as if they were finally approaching the conclusion they had always intended. Judge Zethkalar called the session to order with obvious satisfaction. "Before we hear closing arguments," he announced, "the court has some additional questions for the defendant. Stand up, Lieutenant Commander Morrison." Kate rose to her feet, her military training keeping her posture perfect despite the exhaustion she felt. She faced the judges without flinching, meeting Zethkalar's six-eyed stare with steady determination. "You have listened to hours of testimony about your service record, your character, and the circumstances surrounding the Battle of Kepler 442, the judge began. "But the court finds itself puzzled by certain inconsistencies in your history." He activated a holographic display that showed Kate's service record in detail. Every assignment, every evaluation, every commendation was laid out for the courtroom to see. It was an impressive record by human standards, but Kate could see how it might appear to alien eyes. 6 years of service, Zethkalar mused, running one massive finger down the list. Multiple assignments on various ships, satisfactory performance reviews, but nothing exceptional, nothing that would suggest extraordinary tactical ability or command potential. He looked up at Kate with mock confusion. "Tell us, Lieutenant Commander, what exactly qualified you to make life-and-death decisions for thousands of beings? What great military genius guided your hand in the destruction of the hegemony fleet?" Kate remained silent, following her attorney's advice to let him handle the questioning. But she could feel the trap closing around her, could sense the direction Zethkalar was leading the conversation. "Perhaps you had some special training we are not aware of," the judge continued. "Some secret academy where humans learn to fight against impossible odds. Some hidden knowledge that gave you the confidence to engage 17 enemy ships with only 8. The questions were rhetorical, designed to highlight Kate's apparent lack of qualifications. In the alien judge's minds, she was clearly an amateur who had been thrust into a situation far beyond her abilities and had responded with panic and violence. Or maybe, Zethkalar suggested with a cruel smile, you simply got lucky? Maybe the hegemony fleet was caught off guard by the sheer audacity of your attack. After all, no reasonable commander would have attempted such a hopeless assault. Judge Silara leaned forward, her black eyes reflecting the holographic displays. The court is curious about your thought process during the battle, defendant. When you gave the order to fire on surrendering vessels, what was going through your mind? Did you consider the lives you were ending? Kate's jaw tightened, but she continued to remain silent. Sullivan had warned her that this moment would come, when the judges would try to get her to say something that could be used against her. Every word would be analyzed and twisted to fit their predetermined narrative. Come now, General Thexmore clicked, his insectoid features impossible to read. Surely you can explain your actions to this court. We are not unreasonable beings. If you had valid military reasons for your choices, we are prepared to listen. The offer sounded genuine, but Kate could hear the trap hidden beneath the diplomatic language. They wanted her to speak, to give them ammunition for their final assault on her character and credibility. Admiral Korthvan joined the attack, his forearms gesturing expressively. The defendant's silence is troubling. In Centauri military tradition, a commander must be able to explain and justify every tactical decision. How can we evaluate her actions if she refuses to defend them? Judge Zethkalar nodded approvingly. Indeed. The court is beginning to wonder if the defendant's silence indicates guilt and shame. Perhaps she recognizes that her actions were indefensible. Kate felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, beings from across the galaxy waiting to hear her response. In the gallery, she could see the human officers who had come to support her, their faces filled with concern and frustration. They wanted her to fight back, to defend herself against these accusations. But Kate had learned patience during her years of service. She had learned to wait for the right moment, to choose her battles carefully. This was not yet the time to reveal her true nature to these alien judges. They thought they knew who she was, a weak human female who had stumbled into command through accident rather than merit. Let them think that for now. The truth would come when it was most needed, when it could do the most damage to their carefully constructed narrative. Kate Morrison had not survived 6 years of military service by being reckless or impulsive. She would speak when the moment was right and not before. Judge Zethkalar's expression grew darker as the silence stretched on. His 6 eyes narrowed with growing anger, and Kate could see that her refusal to respond was frustrating him. He had expected her to break under pressure, to say something that would make his job easier. Very well, he rumbled finally. If the defendant chooses to remain silent, the court will draw its own conclusions about her motivations and character. We will proceed to closing arguments, after which this tribunal will render its verdict. The trap had been... Prosecutor Vexithani rose for her closing argument with the confidence of a predator who had cornered her prey. Her scales had shifted to a deep, satisfied purple, and her golden eyes gleamed with anticipation. She had spent the entire day building her case methodically, and now it was time to deliver the killing blow. Honored judges, she began, her voice carrying the subtle hiss that marked all Naga speech. We have heard much talk today about context and circumstances, about impossible choices and military necessity. But beneath all the elaborate justifications lies a simple truth. 17,000 beings died because of the actions of the defendant. She gestured toward Kate with one clawed hand, her movement fluid and graceful despite her serpentine form. Look at her, sitting there in silence like a guilty child caught in wrongdoing. She cannot defend her actions because they are indefensible. She cannot explain her decisions because they were born of panic and incompetence. The courtroom was packed now, filled with beings who had returned for the dramatic conclusion of the trial. The air hummed with tension and anticipation as various species waited to see justice served against the human defendant. The defense would have us believe that Lieutenant Commander Morrison was a hero, forced into an impossible situation by circumstances beyond her control. Vexithani continued, but heroes do not slaughter surrendering enemies. Heroes do not target escape pods filled with helpless survivors. Heroes do not commit genocide in the name of protecting civilians. Her words struck like physical blows, each accusation designed to paint Kate as a monster rather than a soldier. The alien judges nodded approvingly, their various features showing satisfaction with the prosecutor's performance. This defendant was 28 years old with minimal command experience, Vexithani said, her voice rising with passion. She had never faced a true tactical challenge, never commanded more than a single ship, never been tested in real combat. When that test finally came, she failed catastrophically. Judge Zethkalar leaned forward, his 6 eyes fixed on the prosecutor with obvious approval. Continue, Prosecutor Vexithani. The court is eager to hear your final assessment. Thank you, Your Honor, she replied, bowing slightly before turning back to address the full tribunal. The evidence shows that the defendant was fundamentally unqualified for the position she found herself in. Through a series of unfortunate events, command fell to someone who lacked the experience, training, and temperament necessary for such responsibility. The holographic displays above the courtroom showed Kate's service record again, highlighting what Vexathani characterized as a pattern of mediocrity and unremarkable performance. To alien eyes, accustomed to military traditions spanning millennia, 6 years of human service looked pathetically brief. When faced with the hegemony fleet, a competent commander would have sought negotiation, withdrawal, or some third option that did not involve wholesale slaughter, Vexathani argued. But this defendant chose violence first and thought later. The result speaks for itself. She paused dramatically, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom like a funeral shroud. 17,000 beings who went to sleep the night before thinking they would see their families again. 17,000 lives cut short by human arrogance and inexperience. This is not war. This is murder on a galactic scale. Judge Silara nodded gravely, her black eyes reflecting the pain of loss. The court recognizes the magnitude of this tragedy, prosecutor. What sentence do you recommend? Vexathani's scales shifted to a bright crimson, the color of blood and vengeance. Death, Your Honor. Nothing less can balance the scales of justice for such massive loss of life. The defendant must pay the ultimate price for her crimes against sentient beings. A murmur ran through the gallery as various species discussed the prosecutor's recommendation in their native languages. The translation systems worked overtime to convert dozens of different forms of communication into comprehensible speech. Kate sat through it all, without moving, her face a mask of professional composure. Inside, her mind was racing through possibilities and contingencies. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it during the long months leading up to the trial. Now she had to decide whether the time was right to reveal the truth about who she really was. Jake Sullivan stood for the defense's closing argument, his gray hair seeming to have gotten grayer during the course of the trial. He carried himself with dignity, but Kate could see the defeat in his posture. He had fought hard, but the alien court had been determined to find her guilty from the beginning. Honored judges, he began, his voice steady despite the hopeless circumstances. Today we have heard much about the cost of Lieutenant Commander Morrison's actions, but we have heard nothing about the cost of inaction. He activated his own holographic display, showing images of the other human colonies that had been destroyed by hegemony forces. Burned cities, empty settlements, mass graves filled with civilian casualties, the stark evidence of what would have happened at Kepler 442 if Kate had chosen not to fight. 2.3 million lives, Sullivan said simply. That is what was at stake when my client made her decision. 2.3 million men, women, and children who would have died if she had chosen to retreat and preserve her fleet. Judge Zethkalar waved dismissively. Speculation, defense counsel. We cannot know what might have happened if the defendant had chosen differently. With respect, Your Honor, we can know, Sullivan replied. The hegemony's own communications, intercepted by human intelligence, made their intentions clear. Every human on Kepler 442 was to be eliminated. There was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. He showed the translated messages again, the cold, clinical orders for genocide that left no doubt about hegemony intentions. But Kate could see that the judges were unmoved. They had made up their minds long ago. My client faced an impossible choice, Sullivan continued, his voice gaining strength despite the hostile audience. Save her fleet and condemn millions of civilians to death, or fight against overwhelming odds for the chance to protect them. She chose to fight, knowing it would likely cost her life and the lives of everyone under her command. She chose wrong. Judge Zethkalar rumbled. A competent commander would have found another way. What other way? Sullivan demanded, his diplomatic composure finally cracking. What magical solution existed that would have saved both her fleet and the civilians? The prosecution keeps talking about alternatives that never existed. General Thexmore clicked his mandibles disapprovingly. The defense counsel will maintain proper decorum or be held in contempt. Sullivan took a deep breath, forcing himself back under control. Forgive me, honored judges, but the frustration is real. My client is being condemned for making the only choice that offered any hope of saving innocent lives. She is being punished for choosing courage over caution. He looked directly at each judge in turn, making one final appeal. Yes, 17,000 beings died in the Battle of Kepler 442. But 2.3 million beings lived because Lieutenant Commander Morrison was willing to risk everything to protect them. If that is not heroism, then the word has no meaning. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Sullivan had laid out the defense's position clearly and passionately, but Kate could see it had little effect on the alien judges. They saw only the death toll, not the lives saved. Judge Zethkalar looked down at Kate with undisguised contempt. Defendant, you have one final opportunity to address this court before we render our verdict. Do you wish to speak on your own behalf? This was it. The moment Kate had been waiting for through hours of testimony and argument. She could continue to remain silent and let the trial end with her condemnation, or she could finally reveal the truth about who she really was. She stood slowly, her movements precise and controlled. When she looked up at the judges, her green eyes held a steel that had not been there before. The meek, silent defendant was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, you have spent this entire trial asking what qualified me to command a fleet action. You have questioned my experience, my training, my right to make the decisions I made. Judge Zethkalar nodded impatiently. Indeed we have, and we have yet to receive a satisfactory answer. Kate smiled for the first time since the trial began, but it was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator who had been patient long enough. My call sign was Ghost Rider 6. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Every military officer in the gallery, regardless of species, went rigid in their seats. Whispered conversations died as beings who understood the significance of those words tried to process what they had just heard. Admiral Korthvan's 4 hands stopped moving over his holographic displays. Judge Selara's black eyes widened in recognition. Even General Thexmore's compound eyes seemed to focus more intently on the human defendant, who had just revealed her true identity. But Judge Zethkalar, blinded by his own prejudices and ignorance, completely missed the significance of what Kate had said. A ridiculous human nickname, he scoffed, his voice loud in the sudden silence. This proves nothing. Admiral Korthvan stood from his position on the judge's bench, his forearms working frantically over holographic displays that materialized in the air around him. His normally calm demeanor had been replaced by something approaching desperation as he accessed file after classified file from Centauri military archives. Your Honor, he said, addressing the court but looking directly at Judge Zethkalar, I must present additional context that fundamentally changes our understanding of this case. With the court's permission, I would like to admit evidence regarding the defendant's complete operational history. Judge Zethkalar's 6 eyes narrowed dangerously. Admiral, you are a judge on this tribunal, not an advocate for the defense. I fail to see why ancient human propaganda should influence our deliberations. Because it is not propaganda, Admiral Korthvan replied, his voice gaining strength. Ghost Rider 6 represents the single most successful anti-piracy campaign in galactic history. The tactical innovations developed during the Proxima campaign are now standard doctrine in 17. Different star navies, the holographic displays, shifted to show detailed tactical analyses from the Proxima operation, fleet movements, engagement patterns, casualty reports, all the cold, clinical data that told the story of impossible victory against overwhelming odds. 47 pirate vessels destroyed over 6 days, Admiral Korthvan continued, his voice rising with something approaching awe. 0 friendly casualties. Complete pacification of a sector that had been considered permanently compromised. These are not the achievements of an amateur or an incompetent. Judge Selara activated her own displays, showing psychological profiles and tactical assessments from Asari intelligence files. The subject demonstrates unprecedented spatial awareness and tactical intuition, she read from the official reports. Combat effectiveness ratings exceed baseline projections by factors of 10 to 15. Recommended for immediate recruitment to elite tactical units. Even Judge Vorthai was contributing now, her crystalline form pulsing with data streams from collective archives. Post-operation analysis indicates innovative use of sensor shadows, gravitational anomalies, and stellar phenomena as tactical advantages. Subject appears to perceive three-dimensional combat space as integrated system rather than collection of separate elements. The evidence was mounting rapidly, each new revelation adding weight to Kate's credentials as a tactical genius. Military observers in the gallery were nodding approvingly as they recognized operations they had studied in their own training. But Judge Zeth Kalar remained unmoved, his massive frame radiating contempt and anger. "Enough!" he roared, his voice echoing through the crystal chamber like thunder. "I will not allow this tribunal to be derailed by alien fascination with human military mythology." He pointed one massive finger at Kate, his 6 eyes blazing with fury. "The defendant stands accused of genocide. 17,000 beings died under her command. No amount of past success can justify such massive loss of life." Admiral Korthvan turned to face his colleague directly, his gray skin flushed with anger. "Zeth Kalar, you speak of genocide, but have you actually examined the tactical situation at Kepler 442? Have you considered the context in which these decisions were made?"
Context?
Judge Zeth Kalar laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "The context is irrelevant. Dead is dead, regardless of circumstances." "The context is everything," Judge Solara interjected, her black eyes reflecting the holographic data surrounding them. "If we are to judge military actions, we must understand military necessity. Ghost Rider 6 did not achieve her reputation through reckless violence." General Thexmore clicked his mandibles in agreement. "The Hive Collective has extensive analysis of the defendant's tactical patterns. She demonstrates consistent preference for minimal casualties and maximum efficiency. Her actions at Kepler 442 appear anomalous unless viewed in proper context." Kate watched the exchange with professional interest, seeing how the revelation of her identity had completely changed the dynamics of the trial. The judges who had been united in their condemnation were now divided, with only Zeth Kalar clinging to his prejudices. Jake Sullivan seized the opportunity, rising from the defense table with renewed confidence. "Your Honors, if I may present additional evidence that directly relates to the Battle of Kepler 442. Judge Zeth Kalar started to object, but Admiral Korthvan overruled him. "The court will hear the evidence, defense counsel." Sullivan activated new holographic displays showing detailed tactical analyses of the Kepler 442 engagement. But these were not the simplified versions that had been presented earlier. These were the classified reports that showed the true complexity of the situation Kate had faced. The defendant was not simply outnumbered, Sullivan explained. She was facing a fleet commanded by Admiral Thekvor of the Hegemony, one of the most experienced tactical officers in their military. The enemy force included heavy cruisers, battleships, and specialized assault carriers designed for planetary bombardment. The displays showed the enemy fleet in detail, revealing weapon systems and tactical capabilities that had been omitted from earlier presentations. These were not exploration vessels, as the prosecution had claimed, but dedicated warships built for conquest and destruction. Furthermore, Sullivan continued, the defendant's own force was not at full strength. 2 of her ships had suffered damage in previous engagements and were operating at reduced capacity. Her ammunition reserves were limited, and several key systems were offline for maintenance. Admiral Korthvan studied the new data with professional interest. Defense counsel. These tactical parameters suggest that conventional engagement would have resulted in complete destruction of human forces with minimal damage to the enemy. Exactly, Sullivan replied, which is why the defendant employed unconventional tactics that drew upon her experience as Ghost Rider 6. She used the same techniques that had proven successful during the Proxima campaign, exploiting enemy weaknesses while maximizing her own advantages. The holographic displays shifted to show the actual battle progression moment by moment. Kate's fleet movements were highlighted in blue, while enemy positions appeared in red. The dance of ships through space told a story of incredible tactical skill and perfect timing. The defendant did not attack without warning, Sullivan explained. She transmitted surrender demands that were ignored by the enemy commander. She did not target escape pods. She targeted ships that were launching combat shuttles disguised as evacuation craft. Every decision was made according to established military protocol. Judge Solara leaned forward, her expression troubled. Defense counsel, if these facts were available, why were they not presented earlier? Sullivan glanced at Kate, who nodded slightly. Because they were classified above the security clearance of the prosecution team. Only after the defendant revealed her identity could we access the complete tactical records. The implications hit the courtroom like a physical blow. The prosecution had been arguing their case based on incomplete information, presenting a distorted picture of events that supported their predetermined narrative. Prosecutor Vexithani rose from her position, her scales shifting to an angry orange. Objection, Your Honors. If classified information was relevant to this case, it should have been disclosed during discovery. The defense cannot ambush the court with secret evidence. The defense did not withhold evidence, Admiral Korthvan replied coolly. The evidence was classified beyond the prosecution's access level. That is hardly the same thing. Judge Zethkalar sensed that control of the trial was slipping away from him. Regardless of new evidence, the basic facts remain unchanged. 17,000 beings died. The defendant was responsible for their deaths. Justice demands truth, interrupted a new voice from the gallery. Colonel Marcus Webb of Earth Space Navy stood from his seat, his uniform bearing the insignia of the Intelligence Division. Your Honor, I have authorization to declassify certain operational records that bear directly on this case. Judge Zethkalar's face flushed dark purple with rage. Colonel, you have no standing in this court. Sit down immediately or be held in contempt. Actually, Admiral Korthvan said quietly, under Article 12 of the Galactic Military Justice Code, any officer with relevant classified information may request permission to testify. I move to hear the Colonel's evidence. The vote was swift and decisive. 4 judges voted to admit the new evidence, with only Zethkalar dissenting. His isolation was now complete, his authority undermined by his own ignorance and prejudice. Colonel Webb approached the witness stand with the measured steps of a man who had carried secrets for too long. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of classified truth finally brought to light. Your Honors, he began, the Battle of Kepler 442 was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger covert operation designed to end hegemony expansion into human space. Ghost Rider 6 was specifically chosen for this mission because of her unique tactical abilities and proven track record. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps as the true scope of the conspiracy was revealed. This had not been a desperate last stand by an inexperienced commander, but a carefully planned operation by one of the galaxy's most skilled tactical minds. Judge Zethkalar's political career was crumbling around him like a house built on Colonel Marcus Webb's testimony continued for 2 hours, each revelation more damaging to the prosecution's case than the last. The carefully constructed narrative of an inexperienced commander making desperate decisions crumbled under the weight of classified truth finally brought to light. Ghost Rider 6 was handpicked for the Kepler 442 operation by the highest levels of human military command, Webb explained, his voice carrying the authority of absolute fact. Intelligence indicated that the hegemony was planning a massive offensive against 17 human colonies. Kepler 442 was chosen as the decisive engagement point because of its strategic location and defensive advantages. The holographic displays showed star charts that revealed the true scope of hegemony planning, multiple fleet movements, supply lines, and communication. Intercepts painted a picture of coordinated aggression that would have devastated human space if left unchecked. The defendant was given specific orders to engage and destroy the hegemony fleet using any means necessary, Webb continued. The civilian population on Kepler 442 was secondary to the strategic objective of preventing a larger invasion that would have cost millions of lives. Judge Sailara studied the intelligence reports with growing concern. Colonel Webb, are you saying that Lieutenant Commander Morrison's primary mission was not to protect the colonists but to eliminate the enemy fleet? That is correct, Your Honor, Webb replied. The protection of civilian lives was a fortunate secondary outcome, but the primary objective was always the destruction of hegemony naval power in that sector. Admiral Korthvan activated additional displays showing the broader strategic picture. This intelligence suggests that the hegemony offensive would have targeted 43 human colonies over a 6-month period. The casualties would have numbered in the tens of millions. The implications were staggering. What had appeared to be a desperate defensive action was revealed to be a carefully planned preemptive strike designed to save countless lives by preventing a larger war. Judge Zethkalar sat in stunned silence, his 6 eyes wide with the realization of how completely he had misunderstood the situation. His entire case had been built on false assumptions and incomplete information, and now those foundations were crumbling beneath him. Prosecutor Vexathani made one final attempt to salvage her position. Even if the defendant was following orders, she argued, her scales shifting nervously between orange and yellow, the methods she employed were still excessive. Targeting surrender vessels and escape pods remains a war crime regardless of strategic objectives. Colonel Webb smiled grimly. Prosecutor, I think you should examine the classified tactical recordings more carefully. Ghost Rider 6 never targeted legitimate surrender attempts or genuine escape pods. New holographic displays appeared, showing detailed sensor recordings from the battle. The images were crystal clear, revealing facts that had been hidden from the court until now. What appeared to be surrender signals were actually false flag operations, Webb explained. The hegemony vessels were broadcasting capitulation codes, while simultaneously launching combat shuttles disguised as evacuation craft. The defendant correctly identified these deceptions and responded appropriately. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Frame by frame, the recording showed hegemony ships using surrender protocols as cover for continued attacks. Kate had not committed war crimes, she had prevented them. Judge Vorthai's crystalline form pulsed with agitated light patterns. Colonel, why was this information not available to the court earlier? These recordings would have changed the entire nature of this trial. Webb's expression darkened. Because certain parties had an interest in ensuring this trial proceeded without access to complete information. The prosecution requested that all classified materials be sealed to prevent their use in defense arguments. All eyes turned to Prosecutor Vexathani, whose scales had now shifted to a sickly yellow color of fear and embarrassment. That is standard procedure when dealing with sensitive intelligence, she protested weakly. We could not have known. You could have requested proper security clearances, Admiral Korthvan interrupted coldly. Instead, you chose to proceed with incomplete information because it supported your predetermined conclusion. The truth was becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom. This had never been about justice or determining guilt or innocence. It had been a carefully orchestrated show trial designed to humiliate humanity and establish alien superiority in the post-war galaxy. Judge Zethkalar finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. Even if the defendant was following orders, even if her actions were tactically justified, the loss of life remains unavoidable, General Thexmore clicked, his compound eyes fixed on the Valorian judge with something approaching disgust. The Hive Collective has analyzed the tactical situation extensively. No other course of action would have resulted in fewer casualties while achieving the strategic objectives. The insectoid judge's mandibles clicked in patterns that indicated deep thought. Furthermore, our analysis suggests that conventional engagement would have resulted in complete human fleet destruction, followed by successful planetary bombardment. Total casualties would have exceeded 2.5 million beings. The mathematics were stark and unforgiving. Kate had saved over 2 million lives by sacrificing 17,000. It was the kind of terrible calculation that only military commanders could truly understand. But the numbers spoke for themselves. Jake Sullivan stood to address the court. His earlier defeat transformed into vindication. Your Honors, the evidence clearly shows that my client acted within the bounds of military law and strategic necessity. She prevented a massacre by accepting responsibility for necessary violence. That is not genocide. That is heroism. But the real revelation was yet to come. As Colonel Webb prepared to step down from the witness stand, Admiral Korthvan made a discovery that would destroy Judge Zethkalar's career forever. Colonel, the Centauri judge said, his 4 hands working rapidly over his displays, I am seeing classified communications between the prosecution and external parties. Are these authentic? Webb examined the data streams with professional interest. Yes, Admiral. Those are genuine communications intercepted by human intelligence during the pre-trial period. What communications? Judge Silara demanded, her black eyes narrowing with suspicion. Admiral Korthvan's expression grew grim as he read through the intercepted messages. Private conversations between Prosecutor Vexathani and Judge Zethkalar, discussing their intention to use this trial for political purposes rather than judicial ones. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the translation system seemed to pause as the implications sank in throughout the courtroom. Furthermore, Admiral Korthvan continued, his voice heavy with disgust. There are messages detailing plans to suppress evidence and limit the defense's access to classified materials that might exonerate the defendant. Judge Zethkalar's massive frame seemed to shrink as the weight of exposure settled upon him. His 6 eyes darted around the courtroom, seeking escape from the trap his own corruption had created. These allegations are preposterous, he blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Communications between judges and prosecutors are standard. Not when they involve conspiracy to pervert justice. Judge Silara interrupted, her voice cold with anger. Admiral Korthvan, I move for immediate investigation of these allegations. The vote was unanimous except for Zethkalar, who abstained in obvious panic. Within minutes, security officers from multiple species were entering the courtroom to escort both the judge and prosecutor away for questioning. As Zethkalar was led from the chamber in disgrace, his 6 eyes met Kate's for one final moment. The contempt was gone, replaced by the fear of a predator who had become prey. The weak human female he had mocked had destroyed his career without lifting a finger. With the corrupt judge and prosecutor removed, the remaining tribunal quickly reached their verdict. Judge Silara spoke for the court, her voice carrying the weight of true justice finally served. Lieutenant Commander Kate Morrison, this court finds you not guilty of all charges. Furthermore, this tribunal formally commends you for extraordinary service in the defense of civilian populations and the preservation of galactic peace. The courtroom erupted in applause as beings from across the galaxy rose to honor the human officer who had been vindicated by truth. Kate stood at attention, accepting the recognition with the same professional composure she had maintained throughout the trial. But the real victory came moments later, when Admiral Korthvan presented her with the Cross of Galactic Honor, the highest military decoration that could be awarded by the tribunal. It was unprecedented for a human to receive such recognition, and the symbolism was not lost on anyone present. As Kate left the courthouse that evening, she was approached by a young human reporter eager for a statement. Commander Morrison, how does it feel to have your reputation restored? Kate paused, considering the question with the same careful thought she brought to tactical problems. I never lost my reputation, she said finally. It was always there. Some people just weren't looking hard enough to see it. Behind her, accept your species' tendency toward juvenile fantasies. What possible relevance could, Your Honor, Admiral Korthvan interrupted. His. The recess that followed Kate's revelation was unlike any other during the trial. The massive courtroom erupted into chaos as beings from dozens of species tried to process what they had just heard. Military officers huddled together in urgent conversation, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, hisses, warbles, and electronic tones. Judge Zethkalar had reluctantly agreed to Admiral Korthvan's request for a 30-minute break, clearly annoyed by what he saw as an unnecessary delay. The Valorian judge had no understanding of what Ghost Rider 6 meant, and his ignorance was about to become his downfall. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Admiral Korthvan was frantically accessing military databases with all 4 of his hands. His gray skin had turned pale with stress, and his 2 hearts were beating so rapidly that other beings could hear them from several feet away. This cannot be possible, he muttered to himself in the clicking language of his people. Ghost Rider 6 was reported killed in action 2 years ago. The official records clearly state. The official records were falsified, interrupted Commander Jake Sullivan, who had approached the Centauri judge during the recess. For obvious security reasons, Kate Morrison's real identity has been classified at the highest levels of human military intelligence. Admiral Korthvan looked up from his displays, his large skull tilting in confusion. But the Proxima campaign records show Ghost Rider 6 commanding the destroyer Relentless against a pirate fleet of 23 vessels. That was a lieutenant's command, not a lieutenant commander, Sullivan nodded grimly. She was promoted twice after Proxima, both times for classified operations that cannot be discussed in open court. The service record you've been shown represents only her public assignments. Across the corridor, other military observers were conducting similar research. The crystalline Judge Vorthai was interfacing directly with collective databases, her mineral body pulsing with information flows that hurt to look at. Judge Silara was in telepathic contact with the Asari military archives, her expression growing more troubled by the moment. Even General Thexmore, usually impassive, was clicking his mandibles in rapid patterns as he accessed Hive Collective intelligence files. The insectoid judge's compound eyes were processing data streams that would have overwhelmed most organic minds. Back in the courtroom, Kate sat quietly at the defendant's table, watching the chaos she had unleashed with professional interest. The human military officers in the gallery were no longer trying to hide their excitement. They knew exactly who Ghost Rider 6 was, and they were eager to see the alien judges discover the truth. Captain Maria Santos, one of Kate's former subordinates, leaned over to whisper to her companion. "I was there during the Proxima campaign. Saw it with my own eyes. 23 pirate ships, all destroyed in 6 days by a single destroyer. The pirates called her the ghost that rides the void because she would appear without warning, strike and vanish before they could respond." Lieutenant Colonel Alex Chen nodded, his expression grim with memory. 47 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties. The pirates had been terrorizing that sector for months, hitting civilian convoys and merchant ships. After Ghost Rider 6 was done with them, that entire trade route became the safest passage in human space. In another part of the gallery, alien military observers were having similar conversations as the truth began to spread. The name Ghost Rider 6 carried weight throughout the galaxy, whispered about in military academies and officer clubs across dozens of star systems. Colonel Vextar of the Draconian Imperial Navy spoke quietly to his aide. "I remember reading the classified reports from Proxima. The tactical innovations were brilliant, using asteroid fields for cover, exploiting sensor shadows, coordinating attacks across multiple light hours of space. Whoever commanded that operation was a genius." His aide, a younger officer named Sub-Commander Tholix, pulled up tactical analyses on his personal data pad. "Sir, the Proxima campaign is required study at the War College. They teach it as an example of perfect small unit tactics against superior numbers." Meanwhile, Prosecutor Vexithani was discovering that her carefully constructed case was falling apart. Her scales had shifted from confident purple to worried orange as she accessed Naga intelligence files that had been sealed for years. "This is impossible," she hissed to her assistant. "The human defendant cannot be Ghost Rider 6. That designation belongs to someone else entirely." Her assistant, a younger Naga named Silthara, shook his head nervously. "Prosecutor, the classified files are quite clear. Ghost Rider 6 was the call sign of Lieutenant Kate Morrison during the Proxima campaign. The operation was so successful that human intelligence decided to fake her death and assign her to Black Operations." Vexithani's eyes blazed with golden fire. "What Black Operations? Why was this information not included in the case files?" "Because it's classified above our security level," Silthara replied. "I can only access the basic confirmation that Kate Morrison and Ghost Rider 6 are the same person. Everything else is sealed." As the 30-minute recess drew to a close, the judges began to return to their seats with expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment. They had spent an entire day trying a defendant whose true identity would have changed everything about the case. Admiral Korthvan was the most visibly shaken. As a Centauri military officer, he understood better than anyone what the call sign Ghost Rider 6 represented. His people had studied the Proxima campaign for months, trying to understand how a single human ship had achieved such devastating results against overwhelming odds. Judge Silara looked pale beneath her blue skin. The Asari archives contained detailed psychological profiles of legendary military commanders, and Ghost Rider 6 was prominently featured among them. The profile described a tactical genius with an intuitive understanding of space combat that bordered on prescience. Even Judge Vorthai seemed different, her crystalline body pulsing with agitated energy patterns. The collective had attempted to recruit Ghost Rider 6 after Proxima, offering citizenship and advanced training in exchange for tactical expertise. The offer had been politely declined. Only Judge Zeth Kalar remained unchanged, his 6 eyes still showing the same contempt and arrogance that had characterized his behavior throughout the trial. He either could not or would not access the military databases that would have revealed the truth about Kate's identity. General Thexmore was the first to speak when court reconvened. His normally expressionless features seemed somehow more focused, his compound eyes fixed on Kate with what might have been respect. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison," he clicked, his voice carrying new formality. The court has reviewed additional information during recess. It appears that your service record contains certain classified elements that were not previously disclosed. Kate stood to respond, her military bearing now carrying a confidence that had not been there before. That is correct, Your Honor. Much of my operational history has been classified for security reasons. Judge Zethkalar banged his gavel impatiently. Classified or not, it does not change the facts of this case. 17,000 beings died under your command. No amount of previous success can justify such massive loss of life. Admiral Korthvan turned to stare at his colleague in disbelief. Zethkalar, do you not understand what Ghost Rider 6 represents? This designation is legendary among military circles throughout the galaxy. I care nothing for human legends, the Valorian judge replied dismissively. Primitive warriors telling stories about their minor victories. It has no bearing on the charges before this court. Judge Solara leaned forward, her black eyes reflecting newfound concern. With respect, colleague, this is not a minor victory. The Proxima campaign is studied in military academies across 7 star systems. The tactical innovations demonstrated during that operation revolutionized small unit combat doctrine. Furthermore, added Judge Vorthai, her crystalline voice carrying harmonic overtones of urgency, if the defendant is indeed Ghost Rider 6, then her qualifications for fleet command are beyond question. The collective has extensive files documenting her tactical abilities. Judge Zethkalar's expression grew darker with each revelation. He was beginning to realize that his ignorance had placed him in an untenable position, but his pride would not allow him to admit error. I will not be swayed by alien propaganda about human military prowess, he declared. The defendant stands accused of genocide, and no amount of past glory can excuse such crimes. But the damage was done. The other judges were looking at Kate with new eyes, seeing not a weak human female but one of the most respected tactical minds in the galaxy. The trial that had been designed to humiliate humanity was turning into something very different. Kate remained standing, watching the judges' faces as they struggled to reconcile their preconceptions with the reality of who she was. Soon they would want to hear the rest of the story, the classified operations that had made Ghost Rider 6 a legend, and when they did, the truth about the Battle of Kepler 442 would finally be revealed.